It was a bright morning in London, and the city was alive with energy. Tourists from all over the world gathered outside Buckingham Palace, eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Cameras clicked, voices buzzed with excitement, and children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Standing tall among the Queen's guards was Sergeant James Whittaker. His bright red uniform and tall black bearskin hat made him look like a statue, strong, still, and unshakable. His face was serious, his eyes straight ahead, and not a single muscle moved. He had trained for years to stand in perfect discipline, no matter what happened around him. James loved his duty. Protecting the palace was not just a job, it was an honor. He had worked hard to be where he was. It was not easy to be a royal guard. He had to follow strict rules. No smiling, no talking, no reacting to anything, no matter how much people tried to distract him. Tourists often tried to make the guards laugh or take selfies next to them. James was used to it. He had learned to block out the noise and focus only on his duty. The changing of the guard was a tradition that had been around for centuries. It was a beautiful and well-planned event where one group of guards handed over their duty to another. The marching was perfectly timed. The uniforms were spotless, and the guards moved as if they were part of a grand performance. The crowd loved every moment of it. As James stood in his position, his sharp eyes noticed everything, even though he did not move. He could see a man standing near the front of the crowd. The man was dressed in an old jacket and worn-out jeans. He seemed different from the happy tourists. He was not smiling. Instead, he had a strange look on his face. He watched James closely, but not with admiration like the others. James did not react. He had seen all kinds of people in the crowd before. Some were curious, some were excited, and some were just passing by. He had even dealt with troublemakers before, people who shouted at the guards to get a reaction. But James knew his duty. He did not move, and he did not let anything bother him. The man suddenly stepped closer. His hands were in his pockets, and he seemed to be saying something under his breath. A few people near him glanced at him, looking uncomfortable. Some even moved away. James remained still, his training kicking in. He knew better than to react too soon. The air around the crowd changed. The cheerful excitement slowly faded into a quiet tension. People could sense that something was not right. James, standing tall and unshaken, remained on high alert. He did not know what was coming, but he was ready. And then, the man took another step forward, and the real trouble began. This version keeps the reader engaged, builds suspense, and sets up the next part of the story smoothly. Let me know if you want any adjustments. The man moved even closer to the guard line, his steps slow but steady. The people around him noticed, exchanging nervous glances. Something about him felt off, the way he stared, the way he muttered under his breath. Most visitors came to enjoy the changing of the guard with excitement, but this man carried a different energy. James remained still as always, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He could hear the murmurs in the crowd and sensed the shift in their mood. He knew his presence alone was enough to command respect, but he also understood that some people would try to test his patience. Over the years, he had seen all sorts of distractions. Tourists waving their hands in front of his face, people making silly jokes, and even some trying to make him laugh. But this felt different. Then the man spoke louder, his voice sharp and filled with frustration. "What's the matter? Can't even blink." He sneered, stepping even closer. His words weren't meant as a joke. They carried a tone of challenge. Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, watching to see what would happen. James, however, did not move. His training was clear. No reaction, no engagement. The Queen's Guard stood tall, no matter what. But the man was not done. He waved his hand in front of James's face, trying to get a response. When that didn't work, he clapped loudly, hoping to startle him. Still, James remained as steady as a rock, his focus unshaken. A few tourists nearby whispered to each other, wondering if the man would eventually give up and leave. But instead of walking away, he did something unexpected. He bent down and reached for something at his side. A moment later, he gave a sharp whistle. That's when the dog appeared. It was a large, muscular Rottweiler, standing beside the man, its ears alert, its deep brown eyes focused on James, as if waiting for a command. The man gave the leash a quick tug and chuckled. "Let's see if you can ignore this." A few gasps were heard from the crowd. Bringing a dog so close to the guards was highly unusual. Most visitors followed the rules and kept their distance. The guards were there to protect the palace, and it was important to respect their duty. James remained still, but inside, he was fully aware of the situation. He had been trained to handle pressure, but this was no ordinary distraction. A trained soldier knew how to stay calm in front of people, but an animal was unpredictable. The crowd grew more tense. Some took a step back, sensing that something was about to happen. A few people reached for their phones, either to record the scene or to call for help. The air around them felt heavy, filled with anticipation. The man smirked and tightened his grip on the leash. His fingers twitched slightly, as if he was preparing to give a command. And then, without warning, he did. This version builds suspense, keeps the audience engaged, and smoothly sets up the next part of the story. Let me know if you want any changes. The man's smirk widened as he gave the leash a slight tug. His eyes gleamed with mischief as he leaned down toward the dog. The crowd watched in silent anticipation, their faces filled with concern. Then, in a low but firm voice, the man gave the command. The moment the word left his lips, the dog tensed up. Its ears perked, its muscles tightened, and in the blink of an eye, it sprang forward. The crowd gasped as the large Rottweiler lunged toward James, its powerful legs pushing off the ground. The dog's eyes were locked onto him, moving with full force. Everything seemed to slow down for a moment. People expected James to move, to step back, or react in fear. After all, no training could prepare someone for an unexpected attack like this. Would he run? Would he call for help? Would he finally break his stillness? But James did something completely unexpected. With a movement so fast it was almost impossible to see, he shifted his stance. In one smooth motion, he raised his arm, allowing the thick ceremonial glove he wore to take the brunt of the impact. The dog's jaws snapped shut, but instead of biting James, it bit into the padded glove. The crowd stood frozen in shock. Using the force of the dog's own momentum, James turned his body slightly, redirecting the attack. The powerful animal, expecting to land solidly, suddenly found itself off balance. Before it could react, James moved again, calm, controlled, and precise. With expert skill, he guided the dog's movement, flipping it gently but firmly onto its side. The Rottweiler let out a surprised yelp, not hurt but definitely stunned. It had not expected to be outmatched so quickly. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Then the crowd erupted. People clapped, cheered, and gasped, amazed at what they had just witnessed. Some had been recording the entire event on their phones, and now they stared at their screens in disbelief. James had not only stayed calm under pressure, but had also handled the situation with absolute control, without harming the dog at all. The man who had set the dog loose was speechless. His confidence vanished as he stared at James, struggling to process what had just happened. He had expected the guard to panic, to break his stillness, to show fear. Instead, James had shown something else entirely: skill, strength, and complete discipline. The dog, now on the ground, looked up at James with a new kind of respect. Its tail, which had been stiff before, gave a small wag, almost as if it understood that this man was not a threat but a leader. The tension in the air shifted. The crowd was no longer afraid. Instead, they were in awe of the guard who had just done the unthinkable. And then, just when everyone thought it was over, the man took a step forward, his face filled with anger. It was clear he wasn't done yet. This version keeps the excitement high, builds suspense, and sets up the next part smoothly. Let me know if you want any changes. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement and shock. People whispered to each other, replaying what had just happened. Some had caught the moment on their phones, their screens glowing with the incredible scene of James handling the dog with ease. But while the tourists and onlookers were amazed, the man who had set the dog loose was not. His face twisted in frustration. His plan had failed, and he didn't like that one bit. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes locked onto James, burning with a new determination. If the dog couldn't make him react, then maybe he could. The people around him noticed his sudden movement and quickly backed away. Some whispered nervously, hoping security would step in. But James, as always, remained calm. He did not move an inch. The man's voice rose, sharp and filled with anger. "You think you're so tough, huh?" He sneered, stepping closer. "You think you can just stand there and ignore me?" James, of course, did not answer. He had no need to. His silence was more powerful than any words could be. This only made the man more frustrated. He took another step, now standing right in front of James. The crowd held its breath, unsure of what was about to happen. And then, without warning, he lifted his hand. It was a small movement, but it was enough to make people gasp. Was he really about to touch a royal guard? Before he could do anything, a sudden, sharp voice cut through the air. "Step back." The man froze. Another royal guard had stepped forward, his boots hitting the ground with force. His presence alone was enough to make the crowd part slightly. He stood firm, his eyes locked onto the man with an expression that needed no explanation. James remained still, but now he was no longer standing alone. His fellow guard was there, a silent but powerful reminder that the royal guard were not to be messed with. The man's confidence wavered. His eyes darted around as he realized the attention was now completely on him. Not just from the guards, but from the entire crowd. Cameras were still rolling. People were watching. Security was on its way. For a long moment, he did nothing. His hands slowly lowered, and his shoulders tensed. Then, in a quick motion, he turned around. Without another word, he grabbed the dog's leash and yanked it gently, as if trying to act like nothing had happened. The dog, however, hesitated, looking up at James once more before finally following its owner. The tension in the air slowly began to fade. The crowd, still in awe, started murmuring again. Some clapped quietly, others simply shook their heads at what they had just witnessed. James remained in place, just as he had from the beginning, unshaken, unmoved, unstoppable. And as the troublemaker disappeared into the distance, security finally arrived, ready to deal with what came next. This version keeps the excitement high, adds tension, and keeps readers hooked. Let me know if you want any changes. The man quickly walked away, dragging the dog behind him. His shoulders were slumped, and his head was low. It was clear that he was embarrassed, his moment of anger and frustration fading with each step he took away from the scene. He had hoped to cause trouble, to get a reaction, but all he had done was draw more attention to himself. As he walked off, the crowd began to relax. People who had been holding their breath were finally able to exhale. Some of them gave quiet, relieved laughs, while others exchanged looks, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. James stood tall, exactly where he had been all along. His posture was perfect, steady and composed, as if nothing had happened. But the reality was, a lot had happened. The guard had protected himself and diffused the situation with skill, without once losing control. It was an impressive display of discipline and strength, but James wasn't looking for praise or attention. He was simply doing his job. Nearby, a few people came forward, some offering quick words of thanks. Others stood there, still in awe of how calmly and professionally James had handled the entire situation. A young woman approached him with a smile, holding her phone in her hand. "That was amazing," she said, her eyes wide with respect. "I've never seen anything like it. You handled that so well." James gave a small nod, his expression still serious. He was not one for long conversations, but he appreciated the support. He always did. In the distance, a couple of security officers were moving toward the area where the man had walked off. It was clear they were taking the situation seriously, ready to ensure that no further problems would arise. As the security officers spoke briefly to the crowd, asking if anyone had seen what had happened, more people began to gather around. Some of them were still on their phones, sharing the footage of the incident. Word was already spreading across social media. The incident outside Buckingham Palace had quickly become a topic of conversation across London. Back at the guard line, James remained exactly where he had been before, his eyes forward, his body stiff with perfect posture. There was no sign of him relaxing. This was his role, his duty. He had done what was expected of him. And now, the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. The other guards, who had been standing silently by, now seemed more at ease. They knew that James had handled the situation with grace. They had seen this kind of professionalism before, but there was something special about this moment. James had not just stopped an attack. He had done so in front of a crowd, under pressure, without reacting emotionally. A few moments passed, and the scene outside Buckingham Palace slowly returned to normal. The tourists who had gathered for the changing of the guard began to settle down again. The ceremony continued, with the usual marching and precise movements, but something had shifted. The air felt different now. There was a sense of quiet respect in the crowd, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be honorable, no matter what. James, still in position, stood as a symbol of that respect. He had not just protected the palace, he had shown everyone that sometimes the greatest strength is remaining calm, no matter what comes your way. This version builds a sense of reflection, showing how James's actions influenced those around him and keeping the audience engaged. Let me know if you need any adjustments. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, many continued to talk excitedly about what had just happened. Tourists who had once been only interested in the changing of the guard now had a new story to tell. They had witnessed something far beyond what they expected, something that spoke of courage, discipline, and unshakable professionalism. Some tourists couldn't stop discussing how calm and in control James had been. The whole experience was almost surreal. Here was a man who stood perfectly still in the face of danger, without a hint of fear or hesitation. His actions seemed like something out of a movie, but in reality, it was all just part of his training. He wasn't performing for an audience. He wasn't trying to show off. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do. For James, however, the excitement of the crowd didn't matter. His focus was never on the reactions of the people around him. He had a job to do, and he had done it. Now, his attention returned to the duty at hand. His eyes were still locked forward, his mind sharp, ready for whatever the day might bring. As the tourists walked away, some of them glanced back at James, still amazed by what they had witnessed. For them, this was not just another stop on their sightseeing tour. This was a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. They had seen not only a royal guard in action, but a person who had faced unexpected danger and responded with unmatched grace and control. Back near the front gates of Buckingham Palace, the security officers who had arrived a little later were speaking with a few witnesses, gathering the details of the earlier incident. There was still a slight sense of tension in the air, but it was clear that everything had been handled with no harm done to anyone. The situation had been diffused, thanks to James's quick thinking and his ability to stay calm under pressure. The officers, who were now leaving the area, exchanged a few words with James. There was a silent nod of respect between them. They had seen many things in their time, but the way James had handled the incident was something to be admired. They knew, deep down, that this was not the first time James had faced a challenge like this and handled it with absolute composure. A few people still lingered nearby, taking photos of the palace or chatting quietly about the strange events of the day. But as the changing of the guard ceremony came to an end, the crowd began to thin out. The bustling energy of the tourists slowly faded away, and the palace grounds were left peaceful once again. In the moments that followed, James stood firm, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert. He knew that his job was far from over, and as he looked around at the now empty space, he reminded himself that this was what he had trained for. This was his life, a life dedicated to standing guard, not only for the royal family, but for the honor of what he did every day. His job wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about commitment to duty and to keeping his focus, no matter the distractions. And as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow across the palace, James stood as strong and still as ever, a silent protector in the heart of London. This version keeps the focus on James's professionalism, explores the reactions of the crowd, and smoothly sets up the peaceful conclusion, leaving the reader with a feeling of respect. Let me know if you need any adjustments. As the day carried on, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace returned to its usual rhythm. Tourists wandered through the gates, taking pictures of the palace's grand architecture, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. The incident with the dog seemed like a distant memory to most, but for those who had witnessed it, the event lingered in their minds. James, as always, remained in position. His role as a royal guard required him to stay focused and alert, no matter how much time passed. His thoughts didn't drift to the excitement of the earlier moment. Instead, he focused on his surroundings, his posture perfect, his eyes scanning the area. There was no time to relax or lose concentration. Every step, every movement, mattered. But as the hours passed, something unusual happened. A small group of people, some of the tourists who had been there earlier, gathered near the front gates once more. They weren't there for the changing of the guard, nor were they eager to see another ceremony. Instead, they had returned for one reason: to meet the man who had calmly handled the situation with the dog. A few of them approached a nearby security guard and asked if they could meet James. They wanted to thank him personally, to tell him how much they admired his composure and courage. The security guard smiled at their enthusiasm, but gently explained that James could not leave his post. It wasn't long before the small crowd began to grow, their whispers of admiration spreading like wildfire. Some of them had taken photos of James earlier, and now they were sharing those photos with others, showing them the man who had stood strong, even in the face of danger. Soon, more and more people gathered, some taking pictures from a distance, others exchanging stories of how they had watched the scene unfold. For many, it was as if they had witnessed something extraordinary, something rare. In a world full of chaos and uncertainty, the idea of seeing someone stay calm, collected, and professional in such an unexpected situation left a deep impression on them. James, however, remained unaware of the growing crowd. His focus was still on the grounds, the gates, the palace. He had no interest in fame or recognition. His duty was to be present, to stand as a protector for the Queen and the royal family. Everything else was secondary. But despite his quiet strength, the people around him began to speak in hushed tones of admiration. It wasn't long before the story of his calm reaction to the dog became a legend of sorts. It wasn't about the dog itself, but the response, how James had handled a potentially dangerous situation with such grace. The story would stay with these people long after they left London. As the day began to wind down, and the sun started its slow descent, casting long shadows over the palace grounds, the crowd finally began to disperse. Most of the tourists had seen what they came to see, and the chatter around James died down. They had all shared the moment, and now life returned to normal. But for a few, the memory of how one man had handled a dangerous situation with such poise would remain with them forever. And as the last visitors made their way out of the palace, James stood still, unwavering, a silent reminder of the commitment and honor that came with his role as a royal guard. This version reflects on the impact of James's actions, showing how others were inspired by his composure and professionalism while keeping the focus on his dedication. Let me know if you need any changes. As the day came to a close and the last visitors left Buckingham Palace, a sense of peace settled over the palace grounds. The once bustling area was now quieter, with the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the soft murmur of voices fading into the distance. James remained at his post, as he had done since the early morning hours. His posture never faltered. His eyes remained sharp, his focus unwavering. The events of the day were already beginning to feel like a distant memory, but in the quiet moments after the crowd had dispersed, something important was becoming clear. The small incident with the dog had shown everyone who had witnessed it what true professionalism looked like. It wasn't about performing for the crowd or seeking recognition. It was about remaining calm in the face of uncertainty, about handling a difficult situation with grace and control. James knew that his role wasn't one where he sought praise. His job was to be a quiet presence, an ever-watchful protector. He wasn't there for attention, and he didn't need it. But that didn't mean the admiration from the people who had seen what happened wasn't appreciated. The kindness from the small group who had returned to thank him hadn't gone unnoticed. It was a reminder that while his actions might go unseen by many, they were noticed by those who mattered. It was a reminder that even in the midst of duty, he had made a positive impact. As night fell and the lights of London began to glow in the distance, James continued his watch. The world around him moved on, but for him, there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that he had done his job well. He had faced a challenge, and in the end, he had handled it without a second thought, simply doing what was required of him. This was what he had been trained for, what he had devoted himself to. The following morning, the palace grounds would once again fill with tourists eager to see the changing of the guard, and life would continue as usual. But for those who had witnessed the scene unfold just the day before, the memory of the calm and poised royal guard would remain with them. They would tell the story of how, in the midst of tension, one man had shown them what true strength looked like, not in physical might, but in the power of calm resolve. For James, there would be no dramatic conclusions or sweeping gestures. There would only be the next day, the next shift, and the next moment when he would stand guard, ever watchful, ever dedicated. He knew that his duty was never truly finished. Every day brought new challenges, and no matter what they were, he would face them with the same quiet strength and commitment. This was the life he had chosen, the life he had trained for. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about honor, duty, and the quiet pride that came with being a part of something bigger than himself. As the clock struck midnight and the stars twinkled above, James stood still, his eyes gazing out over the peaceful grounds of Buckingham Palace. The day had passed, but his watch would never end. In his stillness, he was not just a royal guard. He was a symbol of dedication and steadfastness in the face of anything that might come his way. This version brings the story to a satisfying conclusion, reflecting on the quiet impact of James's actions and his unwavering dedication. Let me know if you need anything else.